Welcome, Dr. Cahal Moran, to the Asia SenseMaker. You are the author of Why We Are Getting Poorer, something you can see on the screen on the top left. And here is a physical copy of the book. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion and the book, you are also an established YouTuber. I think you gave up the pleasures and the thrill of academia to do YouTube, which is very dry and very boring full-time. So before we get into all of that, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, so I'm Cahal Moran. Like you said, I'm a YouTuber, but my background was in academia. I studied economics, just economics at Manchester, and I stayed on for my degree, master's, PhD. So I was there for 8 years in total. Ended up doing my thesis in behavioral economics, and after that, I moved down to London for my first job, and I was a fellow at LSE in the psychological and behavioral science department. So I've always been quite interested in interdisciplinarity and psychology and economics, as well as biology and other subjects. And I worked there for 4 years. But the thing is, I moved down to London in September 2019, which was quite an interesting time to move to a new city and new job, because obviously 6 months later we went into lockdown, and that was when my work basically dried up because nobody really knew what they were doing. And I was sort of sitting at home, and there wasn't that much to do. We tried to find ways to fill our time, but all the courses were suspended. Research was kind of up in the air. Everyone was, taking care of their children and worrying about the virus. And so that was kind of a prime time to start a YouTube channel. And that's when I did, right, in early mid 2020. And it did pretty well, and well enough that a few years later, I was able to go full time. So I was doing that as well as obviously writing this book. And now I'm just self-employed. I'm still affiliated with LSE as like a visiting fellow, which doesn't seem to mean much. But anyway, I have an affiliation. And I still keep one foot in academia, like I am writing papers, but just very slowly, even more slowly than the average academic.
Great. So one thing about your timing is impeccable. Both you and I'm also an economist, but I did not start as an economist, unlike you. I kind of came to it having done a little bit of political science, a little bit of theoretical ecology, biology, and then finally the big E. But both of us have been traumatized by the global economic crisis of 2008. Both of us got a start right around at the same time. I think I got a start slightly earlier than you did, but the same ballpark. So what was fascinating about your book was that you start writing this book just after the COVID pandemic, because when I read your book towards the end, it says in 2023 at the time of writing of this book, but the book came out in 2025. So the production and everything would have taken some time.
Exactly, yeah.
So tell me, before we get into why we are getting poorer, why are the economists getting on the fringe of policy making more and more? Because if you look at the news today, no self-respecting economist worth their time can argue for the things that are being argued by people who are standing behind the presidential emblem on White House lawns, people in Beijing, people in New Delhi, people in London. What went wrong? Where did all of the economic technocracy go wrong?
It's such an interesting question, and I go back and forth on this. Look, my channel name is Unlearning Economics, right? So that gives you a clue about how critical I've been of my profession. And I also co-authored a previous book almost 10 years ago called The Econocracy, The Perils of Leaving Economics to the Experts, right? Which is about the very technocracy that you're talking about. And it's so complex. I don't want to blame economists for everything that's happened, but certainly I think they had quite a few blind spots. And it's easy to forget that before 2008 in particular, there was a lot of triumphalism around the ideas in economics, things like inflation targeting at central banks, lifted straight out of textbooks, out of undergraduate textbooks, right? You'll study those inflation targeting models. I'm sure you have yourself, right? And that was put into practice directly in central banks. Things like competition policy, focus on consumers and antitrust and how we treated monopolies, all of that kind of stuff, again, came straight out of economics. And also free trade, right? And trade agreements. I think economists were very much cheerleaders for free trade. And that was another thing that I think with Trump and Brexit and a lot of these political backlashes, those are partly a result of what free trade and globalization have done to some communities across the world. So I do think that economists have had these major blind spots. I don't think they really had an eye to things like distribution, for example, things like, power and conflict and class struggle and those kinds of things. I think they were like, no, it's all kind of technical. And I think generally speaking, they were kind of cheerleaders for free markets too much. In the past, I think there's been changes in the discipline since then, but I think economists often defaulted back to that kind of free market position, and they failed to see some of the negative consequences of this, things like rising inequality as well, right? So I do think that in some senses, economists have made a rod for their own backs. I think that people just kind of got fed up with them. You saw that very explicitly during the Brexit campaign here in England, in the UK, sorry. Michael Gove said that people had had enough of experts, right? He said people have had enough of organizations with acronym names and telling them that, they couldn't do this or that because it would be bad for the economy. And I thought that was extremely telling, right? And economists definitely failed during the Brexit campaign to communicate their ideas because they were mostly on the side of Remain. And so there are all of these failures of the economics profession. Now, that's not to take anything away from the fact that economists, I think, are basically right about what's going on right now. I think you and I would probably tend to agree with most mainstream economists about everything that's going on right now. I don't think economists are wrong about that. I don't think it's entirely their fault that they've been entirely rejected. And I'm not completely anti-expert. I think in the Trump administration, we need more experts, economists, not to mention scientists and experts of various kinds, right? So we have to be careful. There's a needle to thread, I think, with this. And I'm at the stage where I'm no longer blaming economists so much for what's going on right now. I think their failures have been acknowledged and they needed to reflect on them. They have partially reflected on them. But now I would very much like to work with economists against what is going on right now.
No, so would I. But essentially, the reason I asked this question is because if you actually look at from 1945, the Bretton Woods Agreement,
Yes.
all the way till the end of history, Francis Fukuyama, you get a sense that the expert economists, they had the higher, for lack of a better word, they had a higher calling and they had a lot of power. For example, in independent India, the institution of the Planning Commission was under the vice chairmanship. And so in India, the technical things are a bit hard because the chairman was supposed to be the prime minister, the vice chairman was effectively a cabinet member, cabinet minister, and he was an economist. And a lot of the first 5-year plans, and not just India, but parts of Africa, parts of newly liberated countries in Asia, they all had this model. And a lot of these people were educated in England. They were getting in some of their training to these new countries. And then suddenly in 1991, you have a remarkable shift. I mean, if you were to look at the dossier of leading financiers and economists today in the world, most of them have some shadow of, if not the Chicago school, then the new behavioral models that are taking over the world. And yet at the same time, I agree with you that the economists know what is going on and perhaps we need to trust them. But at the same time, the trust that people depose and people repose in economists has been coming down. And I think that's a fascinating argument you make in why we're getting poorer when you talk about the billionaires, the different tax dodging schemes that they keep on coming up with. So that was my the reason I asked you the question, because I really wanted your comment. But moving away from that, Let's get to why we are getting poorer. So, why are we getting poorer? This is going to be that intro to this video. So, tell us a little bit about that.
We're getting poorer because the economy is designed in a way that is not working for the average person. And in the book, I split this into two main parts. One, the economy is uneven, which is to say that there are huge inequalities that plague the economy. You talked about the rise of billionaires and the effect that they seem to have on the rest of us. There's also these left behind communities that I mentioned earlier. But the second part is that the economy is dysfunctional. Now, this just refers to the economy, parts of the economy simply not working as they should, right? So the obvious sector would be housing. I don't think you can really name a country that isn't having some kind of housing crisis. Maybe Singapore, but other than that, every country seems to be struggling with high house prices and high rents, not enough availability of housing, extremely poor living conditions, homelessness at the sharp end of all this, right? Every single country across the world seems to be struggling with that. And the thing is, that kind of affects rich and poor alike. Of course, there are inequalities within it, but even people in relatively rich countries are paying just ridiculous amounts for their housing. So a lot of areas of the economy simply haven't been designed properly. They haven't been designed with the average person in mind. And this is just hitting us. And I think a lot of people feel this. A lot of people feel this in their pockets. We saw people literally getting poorer during the cost of living crisis, right? But we've seen for a long time houses and other essentials have been a rising proportion of people's budgets. And now we see, since I've finished writing the book, because I finished writing it in October 2024, we've seen actually the economy just seems to could be shrinking, right? We've seen things like the stock market crash. We've seen price increases as the result of tariffs. We're seeing a looming supply chain crisis again, right? And it could be the US goes into recession. So all of these things, I just think people are noticing them. People are being hit in their pockets, and people are struggling. And I just wanted to try and explain what was going on.
No, you've done a fascinating job of that. You get into a lot of details. But one of the niggling doubts that I had while I was reading the book, because I've been reading quite a lot on the inefficiency of our discipline as well. Because I run a think tank and it's one of the things that we do. But a challenge that keeps on coming up is that GDP, the number that we have turned into a fetish, and a fetish that we have turned into an obsession. It was never supposed to be that. It was supposed to be, once a point in time that we would refer to that. It was made specifically during the war years for doing a job. It has now outstayed its welcome. And yet, the world over, policymakers, wannabe despots, they are all obsessed by this one number. The number keeps on going up. Everywhere you look, you just talked about Singapore not having a housing crisis. It used to be true, but now even investment bankers are saying that Singapore is getting a bit more expensive when it comes to houses. Just imagine, poor investment bank. So I also wanted to understand a little bit about that, because it's not just the discipline that's broken. It's not just that the scammy billionaires are kind of going for it as much as they can, but it is also that in our obsession to have that one number which kind of tells us if the government is doing well or not. You currently have a prime minister who would want to be differentiated from the past one. But frankly and honestly, I can't really distinguish between the last 5 prime ministers of the United Kingdom. They're all the same.
Absolutely. Look, GDP should be simply a measure of like economic output. And I think originally it was designed as more like a measure of like industrial output. And you can understand why you would want to track that. Pardon, sorry.
I'm saying Simon Kuznets during the
Yeah.
Second World War. That's what.
Yeah, exactly. And you can understand wanting to track that when you had a period after the Great Depression and people are like, what's going on? What is the economy? Why is it declining, right? But like he said, it's not a measure of welfare. It's not a measure of well-being. Yeah, it has proved an extremely easy measure for politicians and the media and economists as well to focus on. There are lots of theories that try to explain, where growth comes from. And these don't really ask the fundamental questions that we need to ask about growth, because the simple fact is this: capitalism tends to produce long-term GDP growth on average. Clearly, this leads to some material benefits. You can see, new technologies and general rising standards of living. You can see that, but there are so many huge problems that aren't resolved by growth, and in some cases, like the environment, may be exacerbated by growth, right? And you can see it very clearly in the US, because the US has had very good GDP growth for a rich country since the crisis. Since the financial crisis, they did relatively better than Europe and the UK. After COVID, they were doing really well. It was like 3% GDP growth. Yet the US seems to be the most politically divided and the most socially divided. So it hasn't solved any of those problems. So you really have to ask what's going on. And I mean, a word on Keir Starmer. One of the really interesting things, I can't distinguish between them either. It astonishes me that he would be so stupid, frankly, as to say this government is going to have high growth. It's such a ridiculous aim to say. Like, it's not like you can just like pull a lever and like, oh, now growth's 2%. You're just setting yourself up to fail. And you've seen this because growth's like around 0% at the moment in the UK, right? And it's like, well, number one, they haven't really done anything, so there's no reason that growth would change. But number two, to say you're going to achieve a level of growth is just an absurd aim. It's such an amorphous construct. We don't truly know what causes it. No economic theory has been successful in telling us what causes it. And I think this just speaks to the issue of having other aims, of having aims, social aims or specific economic aims, maybe things like housing, right? Building more housing, just having those. And if you have a good foundation for an economy, then the growth will come. But it really shouldn't be a priority, and certainly not a target, because you're just going to fail.
Yeah, this is fascinating because I think Keir Starmer was in conversation with Mariana Mazzucato, who gave, I'm presuming Mariana Mazzucato would have given some inkling of what to do around innovation, considering that she has this thing about this entire theory about moonshots. And I think after that, after that particular interview, the UK government and Miss Reeves, it's a very interesting. If one were to teach somebody what not to do in economics, perhaps UK and the current UK government would be a case in point. But I'm not just ribbing on the UK government. From your book, there is a very interesting chapter, the second chapter, all of the billionaires and poor millionaires. You really make us feel very bad about them. Really fallen down in hard times.
Yes.
But there is a very interesting anecdote about Elon Musk and his ability to take over companies and become their co-founder. It's just a matter of time. I'm pretty sure that Elon Musk would be a founding father of the United States of America. We should just wait around for that.
In Mount Rushmore, yeah.
Yeah. But here is the thing. Every government in the world, be it the United Kingdom, be it the United States, be it states in India, be it China, be it Germany, and I know that you kind of try and keep the German model to a slightly higher degree. But here's my problem. All of these governments, they reach out to private corporations, beseech them to invest in their country. And somehow that would fix everything. There'll be more jobs, there'll be wage growth, growth will happen, people will be able to consume more. But let's take a step back. Let's see if we have any evidence for that. Let's look at the case of Ireland. That has not happened. Let's look at the case of investments that have gone awry. So many banks, so many steel companies have decided that they're going to make United Kingdom a manufacturing hub again. And yet, time after time, it does not pan out. So something is broken in this economic model. And I think you allude to that. You also kind of towards to how, yeah, I think
you just cut out for a second.
Yeah, I would blame it on internet and other related factors.
Yes.
Do I have to repeat
Billionaires? No, you don't. No, carry on.
So basically, my question is, tell me a little bit about this complicated economic model that we are presented with, and what is the silver lining in all of this? taking away the billionaires from the equation, because I think the billionaires have hijacked our conversations and our minds and their ability to just raise a lot of capital, but really not make any incremental or any kind of progress towards zero unemployment.
I think the billionaires are kind of a reductio ad absurdum, aren't they? Like, and particularly the people like Elon Musk is just sort of a caricature of what you might think of as a capitalist. If you're a sort of raging leftist, you'd be like you couldn't even imagine someone worse than him, right? He's ridiculous. But you're absolutely right. There's a broader, more fundamental question here about how we use the private sector and how we've relied on the private sector for many decades. And it's interesting, we mentioned Mariana Mazzucato because they, as well as the Moonshot book, she wrote this book with Rosie Collington about the consultancy industry and how, how consultancy firms have basically been used to give governments advice and expertise and to subcontract different functions. And there's the question of whether this actually works. And they present quite a lot of evidence to show you that quite often there's a bit of a shoddy job being done, contracts aren't fulfilled, the experts are overpaid. But there's also this more subtle thing, which is the hollowing out of the state. Because often the same people who might have been working for the government, right, hopefully the public interest, they're now working for these consultancy firms, partly because they pay more, right? And so what you have is basically the same people doing this job, but in the private interest instead of the public interest. And I just think that this is repeated across the world, as you say. I mean, sticking to the UK, you mentioned British Steel. Clearly, yeah, it's capitalism when we're in profit. It's socialism when we're in loss. Bail us out, please. Same thing with the banks in 2008. The one that really gets to me, though, is water. Because I live in London and we've got Thames Water, who I'm guessing you know about because they're kind of world famous for quite how incompetent they are.
Yeah.
It's water. It's literally the foundation of life, and yet we've contracted it out to these completely incompetent private firms who are just giving money to their shareholders. They can't keep the water clean and safe. There's been a number of problems in the area where I live with the water. We get like warnings for E. coli every so often and things like that. And I just don't think that this model is working. I mean, we can debate whether there's a space for private enterprise. I think there probably is in the world, but the vital functions, whether you're talking about something that's vital to life, like water, or something like British Steel, which is maybe more of a political, historic fixture of Britain that maybe needs some kind of guarantees. And then, the many functions that these private contractors are doing that Mazzucato and Collington talk about in the NHS, for example. I think these things really deserve to be public or in some sense owned by the people. And we've just completely rejected that. And we've allowed it to be very gradually eroded. I don't think many people realize quite how much state capacity is actually contracted out to the private sector. Because again, it's easy to focus on these headline cases, Thames Water, but it's a lot of things that the government just contracts out, and I think we need to bring those back in. And we can talk about different models to early 20th century nationalization. Maybe we need different models to that, but we also need different models to the one we have now.
Absolutely agreed on that. And this is one of the things that I really wanted to sort of have a conversation with you, because if you go back in the history of United Kingdom, or more specifically England, then just after the Second World War, you have a new Labour government that comes in, Clement Attlee. You've had a massive destruction in the Second World War, right? And yet, the things that England really is known for across the world, the NHS, the Council Estates, the plate glass universities, because I'm also a product of one of the plate glass universities that came up at that point of time. So, and it was all happening at 240% debt to GDP ratio.
Yeah.
And we now have economists whose papers have had Excel errors telling us that if you go beyond a certain GDP to debt ratio, you are somehow committing an 11th sin, which Moses did not get down from the mountain. So reflect a little bit about that, because the agency of the people is being sidelined because they don't have an option to choose. You can make promises, but to get the people to Valhalla. But when you come and sit on the iron throne, as it were, you just don't have enough options open to you. So tell me
There's
a
an
little bit.
economist. There's an economist called Dan Davies, and he has this saying that every accounting system is a mental prison. And I think it's really interesting because all of the debate around public debt, and you get, I hate to focus too much on my own country, but in the UK, we've got this treasury orthodoxy, and they're just insistent that we need to get the debt down, we need to balance the budget. And it's funny because even with this government, you've seen them shift some things from like being counted as current expenditure to being counted as capital expenditure, which means they no longer count in the budget, right? And it's just very much a question of how you look at this. I mean, you said public debt, as a percentage of GDP, but arguably that's not even that good a measure because it matters how much it costs to service the debt. It matters how much capacity you have to service the debt with like current tax receipts and things like that. And I just think that by pursuing a kind of balanced budget, we're really just falling into these accounting prisons. And it's difficult to argue that this is anything but a way to preclude the possibility of positive action, right? As you were saying, because when you launch these big schemes, the NHS, and when you have these big projects and they invest money into the economy, they employ people, they create the foundation for people to have places to live, for workers to have stable places to live. This is very much good for the economy. But the problem is that a lot of these things don't show up on the balance sheet, right? And so, yeah, something like the benefits from, say, a housing scheme which gets a lot of people into housing, that's going to show up on the balance sheet because people with housing are more likely to be employed, people with housing are less likely to commit crimes. But none of that is in the accounting that the government's narrowly pursuing when they're saying, oh, let's have zero, let's have a sort of balanced budget, let's have net zero borrowing or spending. So I really think that we need to think more clearly about how holistic the economy is and how it's integrated with society and human aims, because a lot of these things will show up as positives on the balance sheet if you invest on them. And I mean, to give one final example, we're talking about cuts to disability benefits at the moment. And there's an economist called Emma Holton who wrote this book, Deficit, which I've got somewhere. I don't know if I can find it, but this book, Deficit, which is basically about care work, mostly done by women across the world. And that basically says, look, it's one thing to cut disability benefits and childcare and other things, but what happens? Well, the care still has to be done. You still have to care for people who aren't working or somehow need care, and that's mostly done by women. What do you get? You generally get women withdrawing from the workforce after these cuts. There's a lot of evidence for it. And then you get a smaller economy, right? And you get less tax revenue, and it ends up being self-defeating. So that's just another example, another thing that isn't in these mental prison balance sheets that we have.
Just focusing on this, and I promise you that this would be the last question that involves England or the United Kingdom. So
Yes.
we're going to go global after this.
Okay, good.
Okay. So, there has been a tradition of the British governments, I would argue from Tony Blair's time, that they focused quite a lot on delivery. So if you kind of remember that when Tony Blair came to power in 1997, there was a very interesting mechanism he created in number 10. It was called the Prime Minister's Policy Delivery Unit, if I'm not wrong. And then it was supposed to kind of work on policies, get in more efficiencies, sort of reduce the time or reduce the dropout rates from school and various other schemes. So when the Labour government goes out, and this particular division had lost steam in the middle of Labour itself, but then comes the Conservatives. David Cameron is the Prime Minister, and he starts these nudge units, right? Fascinating ideas. And nudge units, and you're a behavioral economist, I'm a health economist who has done some behavioral work. Yeah. So nudge units are something that were fascinating when they came up, because These are supposed to be experimental evidential units which would make policy interference. They would not cost the exchequer quite a lot, but they would make life easy. And
Yeah.
they did. They were off to a great start. There was a lot of support for them. Interestingly, the British government, the Conservatives, decided to move the nudge units away from number 10. And now Nudge has become a corporation. They're doing a lot of work in Asia, they're doing a lot of work in Africa. So tell me about this super expertise that has crept in policy making and this sort of mountain of evidence that is required to move anything. At times, evidence for should you have a school, should you have an iPhone factory, becomes very, very hard to argue because the numbers are always going to be in the favor of anything that gets you money. But you cannot shirk social responsibility. Throughout your book, you point out that social responsibility is one of the most important duty of care of the government, which the economists, the early economists, I'm talking here of Adam Smith and their ilk, have
Mm.
often talked about. But we are now in a no man's land when it comes to this evidence because everything has to be quantified. Not everything should be quantified. Not everything should be done based on the greater good.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to do things that might be a little costly in the short term, but have huge dividend. Reflect a little bit on this.
Yeah, it's interesting because Emma Holton, who I just mentioned, she has said that there's a little bit of regret that she has to frame these things like care in terms of the economy, right? It's like, okay, so you have to justify them. And I've just done it quite a few times. I've said, look, I don't think these things are at odds with the economy. And I do agree with that. I think that's factually true. But yeah, the question becomes like, what if there was a negative effect on the economy or on the budget or something, then would we still pursue things? And I think it's, if you ask most people, would you sacrifice some money in your life for, a better relationship with your family or something like that? Most people would probably say, yeah, sure, So if these things are at odds, we do need to be able to assert other values, right? Other values than economic values, and understand that really the economy is just one thing. And I think in 100 years ago, or maybe a bit longer ago, it would have been this would have been more appreciated, right? It wouldn't have been so central to everything. Everything has to be good for the economy. We have to have investments to make money. But let me go back to something, because you mentioned the nudge unit, right? And behavioral economics, and this is it really is a great example of so many things. And as a behavioral economist, I often get frustrated with nudge, because I think, to be frank, the evidence for nudges working is mixed. And also, there's so much more to behavioral science than nudging, right? You're talking about understanding people, understanding behavior, right? There's so much more to it than just like, can we change the label on some groceries or whatever to make people buy healthier food? And I find that a very shallow interpretation of behavioral science and of economics. Is it? Sorry, you unmuted yourself. I thought you.
No. Please,
All
please
right.
go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, but then there's this question of, as a subject, it kind of narrows things. But then there's this question which speaks to, I think, a theme of this chat, which is this infiltration of the government, and then this proliferation of all these behavioral science institutes across the world. Now, that on its own, that's not a bad thing. I'm happy with having expertise on behavioral science across the world. But there is this question of whether these really narrow nudges have replaced some of the more fundamental actions that we've been advocating for, right? So there was actually this article written by I think it was George Osborne, the UK Chancellor, and Richard Thaler, the 2017 Nobel Prize winner. I think it was those two, but something like that. It might have been Cameron. I can't remember. But there was this article in around 2011 or something, and they basically said out loud, they said the quiet part loud, we are pursuing nudge because the space for more activist government and bigger interventions has gone, right? And Osborne's the architect of austerity. He's implementing austerity policies, massive cuts to public services, to local services, right? And they're then saying, well, we can use these basically costless behavioral tweaks to change behavior. And so what you see there is quite literally, it's not a conspiracy. You see behavioral economics being used at the service of neoliberalism, right? You see it replacing far more activist and fundamental government. And you see the people who are arguably the biggest behavioral economist in the world and the chancellor of the UK at the time writing an article in The Guardian saying, this is what we're doing. And that can only be a negative thing. And I think a lot of behavioral scientists that I know are quite regretful that not only is it being channeled into just nudge behavioral science when there's much more to it, it's been used to this end. Now, there was a lot in your question, so I'd like to try and answer all of it if I can. There was this other question about evidence, right? And how we use evidence. Now, the neat thing about behavioral science and nudge is that you can do randomized control trials, right? And this is something, these have been used a lot in development. And you had the, I can't remember which year, but the Nobel Prize 2019 to Esther Duflo and Banerjee, I think it was 2019, right? They're pioneers of RCTs. And that's like, you've got a control group, you've got a treatment group. They've got the inspiration from medicine, give treatment a pill, give control a placebo, see if the drug works. And economists were like, hey, can we do this with policies? Because it seems like the economy is really hard to study macroeconomically what on earth is going on, right? We have to look at like history, and there's the data are terrible and our models don't really work. But if we've got these RCTs, we can say, no, this policy works. Give people a goat, and in this village a goat, and then they'll do much better or whatever. And while I think this is statistically correct and there's a place for RCTs, again, it's replaced more holistic policy. I don't think RCTs deliver everything they promise, and we can maybe get into that. But even if they did, you have to accept that sometimes you have to make changes that don't have that kind of evidence base. Sometimes there are other reasons to make it. Sometimes there are value-based reasons. Sometimes there are other types of evidence. Did we have an RCT for the NHS? No, you can't implement the NHS in one village and then not in another village, right? It was just a much bigger change. So I really think that these things have confined our thinking a lot, and they've really trapped us.
Right. And the reason I asked this question is because today I think economists, because of the sheer scale of the global economy and the complexity, they don't really want to deal with larger questions. I think if I remember correctly, you just put out a recent video in which you were you take a long look at the madness of economics. Congratulations on that.
Yes, thank you.
But this altar of efficiency that the economists have created and the policymakers have helped them create, everything has to be efficient. And you make quite an interesting football analogy. And I would actually like you to make that analogy again. But also, here is my question. What should be the culpable standard for how much efficient you ought to be? Because if you are living through times where the world's largest economy is not able to convince a 25-year-old in Alabama that having a COVID shot is good advice, and where the current HHS secretary is telling new parents that they should perhaps do their own research because they've just discovered that NIH, after years and years of functioning, might really not be the best place to do advanced virology research or research of that sort, because everything has to be efficient, from the smallest unit to the largest international framework for finance.
Yeah.
But this efficiency comes at a cost of common sense. You could argue that Manchester United is a very efficient operation, but can people living in Manchester, could you as a former Manchester graduate, can you go every day to the Manchester football stadium and watch a match? Because at a point of time, it was all about local local problems, local context, local sportsmanship. Today, it's very global. This efficiency argument only works if you are looking at it from a huge superstructure. But
Yeah.
economics has always been at odds with superstructure. Um, there have always been these big divisions. Tell me a little bit more about how do we get out of this?
I think so. I mean, yeah, the football analogy for me was quite a clear example of how something that a lot of people across the world, and especially in the UK, kind of identify with, something that a case where the aim of profit, efficiency, revenue, money clearly doesn't coincide with the aims and values of most of the people consuming the product or participating, right? So obviously these massive clubs that make a lot of money, like you mentioned, Manchester United, Chelsea would be another one, bought by Roman Abramovich in 2003, right? That these clubs don't necessarily produce the best football. That's very clear, especially this season. They don't, but they also don't produce the best outcomes for fans. And you've seen this thing where football was and still is a very working class thing and a place for communities to gather. And also like a place for political meetings to take place in the past. That used to be the case. Now ticket prices are way up. It's so hard to get hold of a ticket for a good club. I mean, I'm a Liverpool fan, right? The only time I could get tickets was back when Liverpool were quite bad. And then as soon as they get good, there's more box seats, right? All the ticket prices go up. There's more demand. You just can't get them. And therefore the fans are just not as connected to their club anymore. Now, I contrast this with the German model, where the fans actually own the club. They have the 50+1 rule, which means that it's 50% plus one of the club is owned by the fans. So they've got a majority stake. And what you see there is just that they have lower ticket prices. The fans have much more connection to the local community. You also see things like the German national football team is actually quite good because they have this kind of grassroots focus on nurturing these talents. The Premier League is an amazing league, but it's highly international, and the English football team is comparatively pretty bad because it's just people are just disconnected, right? They're unmoored from like any sort of community. So there are lots of ways that the capitalist model doesn't deliver the best results for football fans. And I just hoped that this was like an accessible example, but there's so many different examples, right? And I mean, you talked about things like scientific institutes, health institutes. It's really difficult to for these institutes to narrowly justify themselves, right? They're sort of, research is inherently uncertain. You're sort of reaching out into the ether, and you try something, you're picking out ideas, and maybe it doesn't work, or maybe it doesn't work now, but in 20 years somebody's like, oh, I can use this, right? And that's just how it works. It's so long term, it's so uncertain, and that just isn't amenable to quarterly profits demanded by shareholders. And so there are so many of these things that we really, really value that clearly are at odds with the profit motive. And how do we address it? You asked how we address it. Well, I do think that the German football example is an illustrative one, because I do think that communities need to take control of things, and not in a sort of vapid Brexit way of taking control. I mean, actually take control as in be on the boards, be managing these companies, these organizations, have local meetings, participatory meetings where people can actually have their say on what happens. And things like taking control of the workplace as well. This is one of the big ideas in the book. It's about demos, and which is just like a more fine-grained idea of democracy and participation than we currently have. And I think that the great thing about this is that, unlike a lot of these, if you ask me, how do we get rid of Trump and Musk? I mean, I don't know. It's like requires that I'm not even in the US and it's affecting me. Even if I was in the US, I'd feel powerless, right? But with a lot of these more local, more communal activities, you can get involved, right? You can actually get involved in democratic participation at the local political level, or at something like, I mean, I recently joined like a credit cooperative, just something like that. And a lot of people who do this say that it's extremely empowering. You actually see change happen. So I feel like, I'm not saying let's abandon the higher level fights, but I'm just saying that this is one way that you can take control and realize that, you know, you actually can make a difference.
I think I agree with you on that. And that kind of helps me frame my next question, which is basically this. Uh, Give us a little bit about the hope. We have discussed a lot about these dark times, but your book is not just doom and gloom. There is
No.
some hope there as well. So, first, tell us a little bit about that hope, and then I'll come to the next part of this question.
The title might suggest that it's a pessimistic book. Everything's getting worse. There's nothing we can do about it. That's very much not my attitude. For a start, I try to adopt a bit of an upbeat tone. I don't think it's a sort of depressingly written book, or I hope it's not. But more importantly, I am very focused on the solutions and the potential that humanity has. And I think that is really what this book is about. It's about potential. There are so many ways that we can improve the world. Many of them are tried and tested. I mean, just things as simple as like basic nutrition and vaccines and things like that, right? Which have actually made a big difference across the world for in the past few decades. There has been great progress on those fronts. We can continue with those and we can expand them. But I do have this great belief in humanity. I think that we do find ways to adapt and overcome our problems. And I mean, going back to what's happening in the USA at the moment, there has been a lot of resistance. You know, we've seen a lot of resistance, even things like the Tesla boycott, which I thought was amazing. You know, capitalism has its flaws. It does give us the power of our wallets. It does give us the power of our money. And if people band together and do a consumer boycott, you know, it can ruin a company. And it has had a huge effect on Musk, and it's caused him to step back from what he was doing in the government, right? So just things like that. I think we see a lot of positive action across the world. And I am optimistic that there are a lot of good ideas out there, and that governments can and do enact them. I mean, again, look, we've just seen in Canada. What's Canada just done? Okay, the Liberal Party's won. But that, I think it was interpreted correctly very much as a rejection of Donald Trump, right? You know, in a strange way, that the Canadians were saying, well, the Conservatives are kind of closer to Donald Trump. They're not Donald Trump, but we're not going to go for that, right? And so, you know, you see all of these promising changes. You see these reactions. You see things like the EU starting to integrate a bit more and get their act together and saying, well, okay, well, we can't rely on the US at the moment. So what are we going to do? And are we going to integrate with the East more, right? I think these are things that could be very, very much positives. So yeah, I am actually cautiously optimistic. There are obviously some really horrible things happening at the moment, but we can and should fight tooth and nail against them.
As I said, so housing, building housing,
Yeah.
getting everybody a house, everybody agrees it's a great idea. Um, there was a great program that used to air a long time ago. I think it should be remade, or it should be broadcast 24/7 as a live stream. Yes, Prime Minister, and yes, Minister. Regulations. Everybody wants to do away with them. But I think we need regulations back. Private equity should not be allowed to own apartments. Venture capital funds were created to take risks. Today, they do anything but take risks. So there's a model that works well in America. Chinese VC funds are going to replicate them in China. Indian VC funds are going to replicate them in India and create an illusion of success. So we wasted $900 billion, but hey, we've made a profit of $5. So we've shown that. How do we get regulation back? How do we make regulation for the people? Because right now, regulation is anything but for the people. And your book reflects that, because today millionaires are poor and billionaires are exploding like a petri dish penicillin experiment. Where are they coming from?
Yeah, I might steal that analogy. You know, someone who's been a real influence on me and also quite inspirational is Lena Khan, who is an antitrust expert, and she wrote this book, this paper, Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, where she basically went through how modern antitrust laws, which are very focused on consumer prices, had just completely missed the growth of Amazon into basically an economic empire, right? And you see that now. Jeff Bezos can kind of do anything he wants, send Katy Perry to space for no reason, whatever, right? So you see all of this. It reaches beyond just cornering his own industry, which he's surely done. It reaches into other areas of life, right? And that is a result of failed regulation. So what Lina Khan did was made a very powerful argument about why that matters, why these economic kings matter in themselves, why we wouldn't tolerate, a dictator anywhere else, seemingly, but we tolerate one over these fundamental industries and other industries that they may care to reach into. But she's also put it into practice. She's now working in antitrust. For some reason, as far as I'm aware, she seems to have evaded the ire of the Trump administration. I don't know why, if that's just because of how good she is, or if it's partly because they kind of hate the tech monopolies, his base as well. So maybe they're okay with breaking them up. But whatever it is, she hasn't been targeted by them as much. And they continue to be doing good antitrust work. So I do think it's very much a case of putting forward very powerful arguments for public regulation. And one thing that, in the UK, all our regulatory bodies are independent. I was talking about Thames Water, where you have Ofwat, or I don't know how you pronounce that, but all our regulatory authorities are called like Ofwat, Ofcom, So they so they're independent. They're actually kind of at arm's length from the government, and I do think this may be something that was done a bit at the behest of economists who think that regulation should be technocratic and disconnected from the will of the people. I couldn't disagree more. I think that it has to be absolutely connected to the government. These regulatory authorities have to be brought in, and you have to do it with the public interest in mind, because again, Thames Water are completely incompetent, and either you are heavily regulated, or you are nationalized, or you are brought under the control of local residents or something like that, right? And I think regulation, for me, I mean, we will always need regulations, health and safety and so on, right? But in terms of regulating these vital utilities, which Amazon also is, by the way, it's now a global logistics network. It's a utility, right? It's an online network. People need it. You have to. It's almost impossible to do anything with respect to delivery and online advertising or anything like that without using Amazon. It is a utility. Regulation is a compromise, right? It's a compromise. It's saying, look, we're not going to seize control of you, but you basically have to abide by these laws. And I think regulators have just become so toothless and so technocratic that we've lost sight of that. So absolutely bring, massively expand regulatory authorities. We're talking about funding, but it's not expensive. It's just there'll be some more funding, and make sure that they are under public control and under the control also of experts like Lina Khan, who's just amazing at what she does. But there are more people out there who can do things like that and revolutionize regulation.
Absolutely. That brings me to my last question, because it's been a fascinating 54 minutes. And here it goes. Actually, two last questions. So let me sneak one more in. We have now heard a lot of rhetoric about civilizational industries. I understand the term. I don't understand the impact. I don't understand the thinking behind it, because last time we checked, industries and industrialists should fail. They should be allowed to fail, because there's a fascinating economist, Paul Ormerod, who wrote a popular book called Why Most Things Fail. He makes a case for 99% things are going to fail. So you have to design for it instead of against it. And we often design against failure. So when a company is going down, as you said, socialism, once the losses are there, so you want the government to step in and say, hey, we're going to save it. I think the government has to provide indemnity to people who are losing jobs, not to the CEOs, so that they can earn $700 million a year, or whatever they're earning these days. So you have had a silent change in the perception of billionaires. It also becomes very clear in your book. Elon Musk, let's stick to our example, is extremely popular the world over. There are people who will swear by him because he's supposed to be this tech maven, this brilliant man on a mission to save the world, and apparently take everybody to Mars. How do we kind of look at this? How do we look at this paradox where citizens are batting in favor of people who will never see them, hear about them, think about them, and don't really care about them? But you have people who are convinced that Musk and Trump are one of them, just because you can't really spot the brand that they're wearing. So they are on your side. Tell me a little bit about this paradox, because I don't think it really comes through. A lot of the people who are impacted by these chaps, they end up batting for them. They end up giving their lives net worth. I mean, when Trump launches a meme coin, people go after it as if it's backed by Federal Reserve.
Yeah. I mean, so in terms of this idea of failure, I do think these two things are kind of linked, because when you were saying that, I was thinking, well, these billionaires and other private companies, right, as we've discussed, they've taken up so many vital functions in government that it's like, firstly, they're unlikely to fail because they're living off taxpayer largesse, right? But also they can't fail. Look at Starlink, right? Elon Musk's satellite system. That can't just go down. That business can't fail, right? It's like, it's vital to so many communication functions and in wars, right? So it literally cannot fail, and yet it's privately owned. So I think they've managed to insert themselves, like parasites, right, into these vital functions, right? And that's one reason that we're not allowing things to fail. I do also think there is perhaps a broader cultural issue, or maybe a couple of cultural issues that you're touching on there, which is maybe we won't let British steel fail in this country. And there are good reasons for that. Like you said, the workers, right? Of course, people in struggling communities, right, where it's like, this is like the one thing that holds that community together, they're going to lose their jobs. In the UK, unlike in Sweden, for instance, we don't have any way of fully supporting these workers and families as they move around, retrain, or perhaps encouraging another industry in the area, right? So we need to look at that. But I do think perhaps we are not willing enough to let things fail. I kind of agree with Paul Ormerod on that. And I don't know when that started. Maybe it started in 2008 when we wouldn't let the banks fail, or I'm not sure, but it is, we can't save every industry forever, right? That you're just going to end up with a bunch of dated industries that don't really work, right? So that's definitely something to think about. The other cultural issue is, why do people end up identifying with these people? And I mean, there's this famous quote, I can't remember who it is, maybe John Steinbeck, who said most of the poor see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? And you can update that to billionaires now, right? Maybe millionaires see themselves as temporarily embarrassed billionaires. So, like, I think a lot of people do look up to these guys and do tend to believe what they're doing. And one thing I would say is that, Elon Musk, he used to be kind of an interesting guy. I think he was always a bit of a bastard, but he did used to be kind of an interesting guy. And he was definitely putting forward a vision for the future. And he's good at doing that. That's why he's so good at like raising capital. He kind of puts forward this vision, and he's like, I'm going to land on Mars. And it doesn't, people don't care that he has said that like loads of times and still hasn't, but he's like, he puts together a vision, and he's like, this is going to happen, gets people to invest, gets the population to believe in him, and, does make some things happen, even if he's a bit over optimistic. He did create Tesla, and he believed in it even when it was about to go bust. And that has really changed the electric car industry, right? So I do think that there's this question of, are we as more progressively minded people putting forward a vision? Are we putting forward a positive vision of how the world could work that people are latching onto? And if you look at someone like Keir Starmer, so sort of laughing at the idea that he's putting forward a positive vision. I don't know what that man stands for. But if you look at someone like maybe Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they're much better at that, right? And I think maybe we can hate these men, but we could also maybe learn from them, because I do think that there is something to be said about giving people something to believe in, that maybe on the left we're a bit, I mean, you know, the title of my book's Why We're Getting Poorer. Maybe we're a bit like down on things, and, you know, it's just oh, everything's so bad and blah blah blah. Maybe we need to think about that. I don't have the answer to how to do that, but maybe we could think about it.
So, my last question,
Yeah.
and with this, we're going to end. When do you see the change from why we are getting poorer to why we should take care of the poor in
Yes.
our economies? Because right now, the narrative is that if you're poor, it's because you did not make, I mean, the Protestant American thing has made its way all over the world, including
Mm.
in global south. So you're
Mm.
poor because you are not doing enough. How do we take the agency back from this? You know, how do we kind of start saying that you are poorer because economic decisions are stacked against you? And how do we get people to move away from pyramid schemes and
Mm.
quick rich schemes that a lot of people on YouTube are shilling behind, and a lot of people are falling for it?
You know what really amazes me is how, while there's a very powerful cultural force in favor of, you know, the American dream, in favor of idolizing the rich, there's an equally powerful tendency for people to kind of hate the rich and to feel like they're being ripped off, you know, and to hate company, you know, get anybody started on, like, what was the last interaction you had with like customer service? I mean, I was trying to sort out my broadband this morning, and I just can't get into contact with a person with Virgin Media. It's like, it's absolutely infuriating, and it's a shared experience, right? Everybody knows that experience, especially today with the digital economy, and just nothing works. You know, you can't speak to a person. It sends you in a loop, and it's like, no, this won't work. Are you just like, oh my god, right? Similarly, people feeling like they're underpaid, right, and overworked, and they don't like their boss, right, and people should listen to their ideas more. Those are things that I don't think we need to implant them in people. I think they already recognize them. And I feel like we, again, this is something that maybe as progressives we don't appeal to enough. Again, Bernie Sanders is pretty good at this kind of thing, but we're not like, you know, just the leftist positions that people already hold. You know, they're kind of leftist. They're common sense in a way, right? You know, I'm being ripped off. I hate dealing with this massive corporation. I'm not being paid enough. You know what I mean? I've been treated really badly by the government in various ways. I think that we can really, really harness those. And I also think that I don't know. Maybe I'm being naive here, but in my opinion, if you ask people, you know, let's take people who are below the global poverty line, below $2.15 a day. I think if you asked a lot of people around the world, you know, are those people just not working hard enough? You know, they would say that, you know, no, that's clearly ridiculous. That's not, you know, you're not starving because you're not working hard enough, right? And so I do think that there are these general beliefs already there, that are basically correct and are in accordance with these kinds of values. It's just about how we choose to appeal to them a bit better, because maybe, I don't know, maybe we've been focusing on the wrong things.
Yeah, I agree. But perhaps when you're done with your book tour, because I see that you're going on quite a few
Hmm.
places, and I think you need to talk more about this book. It's a fascinating book, Dr. Cahal Moran. I would like to welcome you again and sometime. Perhaps have a longer chat about IP, because
Mhm.
intellectual property is something that you have written. I'm pretty sure there's a lot more there that has to be brought out. But
Yeah.
thank you for doing it today.
Thank you so
Fascinating.
much. Really interesting.
All right. See you.
See you.